I haven't yapped in a while, like 2 months at this point, I think. Honestly, I just haven't really had anything to say, which isn't like me because I feel like I always have something to say. Like, if I don't have something, I'll find it, you know? But yeah, I just haven't had anything to say, and then I think also I have been just like, depression do be hitting. It really do. So I've just been fighting for my life, you know. It's tough out here. I'm sure you all know. I'm sure some of you know. Um, the brain is crazy. The brain is wild. I found this book, Sincerely Your Autistic Child, and I believe it was put together by the it's like Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. They used to be the Autistic Women's Network, and there are just a bunch of different contributors. Highly recommend. I've cried like every other page so far, just because that is just, especially if you are late diagnosed, this is mostly like women, non-binary people. I'll be crying to this. I'll be continuing to cry to that. It's really healing to just like come across living examples of you and people who have lived through things that you've lived through, especially when for the longest you didn't know that other people lived through it. It's really healing, and I feel like that'll always be important for those of us who like grew up just having no idea what the fuck was wrong with us. And I say that because that's the feeling, but I will continue to air quote it because we're perfect. I just couldn't help think about the fact that I wish little me had things like this, or even knew what the word autism meant, like, let alone knowing other autistic people or being able to talk about my experience. And it's crazy that I like learned a new language in a sense when I got to know what I know about myself. I think one of the very, very, very exhausting things about being autistic and about loving people that aren't autistic or having non-autistic people love you is that you have to explain yourself. You have to explain yourself. If a person is not autistic, even if they are autistic, they're still not you, so they're not going to entirely know what you want, what you need, what your experience of the world looks like. And one of the really exhausting things about that is having to communicate those things, having to figure out how to tell someone else like what the world is like for you. And it does suck, and the burden shouldn't entirely fall on the autistic person. The non-autistic people in their life should also make an effort, but it isn't easy, and it does take two. Both sides have to be willing to put in effort and care in order for things to kind of flow more smoothly. And I want to talk about like some general tips for communicating with autistic people. Every autistic person will have their differences and their preferences, but I feel like there are some like strong like foundational characteristics of communication between autistics and non-autistics. I feel like it's safe to like establish some of those, because even if it might not apply to a certain autistic person, it's not gonna do harm. Like, I think generally like following these principles, like even in everyday life, it's not going to hurt anyone. If anything, it will just help or make the situation a lot more neutral for different people. So the first thing that I think is really important is giving the person time to process. Autistic people quite literally process information differently. We might need more time to process information, which means we may not be able to respond as quickly as typical or as quickly as you would hope or expect us to. It doesn't mean that we're bored. It doesn't mean that we don't want to listen to you. It means that we simply just need time. So like when you are communicating with an autistic person, just give them time. Like this especially applies to me in like verbal conversations, and it's also why I prefer like text, because text allows you that processing time. Like you are not sitting in front of someone, they are not looking at you, they are not waiting for your response. They are, but it's just different than having like a face-to-face conversation. For me, it can be really stressful, especially if it's like a serious conversation and I just can't think. Like I need like time to just like sit there in silence and process what has been said and then try to make sense of it and figure out what I'm going to say in response to it. So generally I think it just requires patience. You're just going to need to be patient. And I think it's never a good idea to try and like force someone, autistic or not. Like, don't pressure or force someone to speak sooner than they're ready or able to. Say what you mean and mean what you say. A lot of autistics take things quite literally. A lot of us miss things like sarcasm, or miss things like tone, or take what you say like in its most literal sense. Some of us might have this problem to a greater extent than others, but yeah, it becomes a problem when we are talking to people and they are not saying what they mean and not meaning what they say. And I say this because I feel like generally autistic people communicate in this way as well. Like, I always say, I say what I mean and I mean what I say. Like, if I said it, I meant it. Like, that is exactly what I meant. There's no hidden meaning, there's no underlying meaning. Don't try to dissect it because I said exactly what I meant to say. Neurotypical people don't do that a lot. A lot of the times they will say something and there is an implied meaning, or there is a suggestion kind of like hidden behind their words, and we might miss that, and that's just an opportunity for conflict. And I feel like if everyone were just more direct, if everyone kind of just dropped the flowery language, it would be a lot easier. This kind of ties into the same point that I'm making now, but in terms of like sarcasm and passive aggression, these are all things that kind of rely on like implied meaning and tone and maybe even like body language or facial cues. And again, these are things that autistic people struggle with, so maybe just tone it down. And for me, I'm actually a highly sarcastic person, which is pretty ironic. I have always been very sarcastic, but the difference is that people, well, no, they don't always know when I'm being sarcastic, so I think I also am sarcastic wrong. Or it's like I'm being serious, but people think I'm sarcastic, which might be because my voice is like, you know, and typically people, when they're being sarcastic, they're like super like flat and monotone, but this is literally just me talking. I need to take my own advice, apparently. But yeah, there's lots of times where we might miss sarcasm. You're like, oh wow, like that was really fun. I'd be like, really? Like, I didn't like it. And you're just like, oh no, like I was being sarcastic. Or so many times someone will say something to me and I'm just like, what? And they're like, it's a joke. And for me personally, it's not that I can never catch on to those things, but you need to make it really obvious. Like, you need to make it really obvious that it's a joke, or you need to make it really obvious that you're being sarcastic. And because of that, I feel like when you're communicating with autistic people in general, there are probably some moments and some situations where you just might need to choose another approach. Like, that might just not be an effective way to communicate in the moment. Maybe sometimes it is fine. It depends on your autistic person, not your autistic person. Yeah, your autistic person, the autistic person in your life that you love or care about. It depends, right? But generally, maybe tone it down. Maybe tone it down a little bit. The same thing with being passive aggressive. Again, not nice to do to anyone, like, truthfully, but it could be especially problematic or confusing to autistic people because we might not catch on to the fact that you are being passive aggressive. Or if we do catch on to that fact, we might not understand that that passive aggressiveness has a hidden or implied message behind it, and you are explicitly like telling us to do something, or you want something for us, but we aren't able to recognize what that is. So maybe just tell us how you're feeling, because it is also possible that we will miss it entirely. And for those of us who may catch on, I think some of us struggle exceptionally to deal with conflict. I know I do. I kind of learned to like avoid conflict at all costs, no matter like how much it may have hurt me, like just kind of like accepting the circumstances, you know? So yeah, passive aggressive behavior was something that like broke me. Like, if someone like treated me in a passive aggressive way, it like broke me, because I'm like, I don't know like what to do. Like, I can sense conflict, I can feel the vibe, even if I'm not like understanding exactly why or what's going on. I can like feel the energy from the person, you know, and it just like breaks me. It's like, it's awful. And this is just not an effective communication strategy in general, if I can say. But yeah, applying it to autism, I feel like a lot of these things can just be a lot worse than they really need to be. Depending on the communication needs and or preferences of the autistic person in your life, just respect them. Just respect them. Words are not the only form of communication. They are not the only valid form of communication. For an autistic person who cannot speak with words, maybe in the moment or maybe indefinitely, whatever they are doing to communicate with you, that is their language. So just respect that. If I cannot speak, for example, and I resort to typing, sending a text message, some people have AAC devices that communicate what they want to communicate. They help them do these things. Sounds, gestures, however the autistic person in your life communicates, like if you love them, if you care for them, you need to learn their language. The moment that someone is recognized as non-speaking, it's almost as if their worth or value as a human being is just like decreased in the eyes of society. And who's to say that this way of communicating is any more valuable than doing so without words, than typing, than writing, than pointing, than like who is to say that anything is less valuable than the other, right? And it might not always make sense to you, an autistic person's attempts at communicating, and it doesn't have to, but again, if you love or care for the person, you need to be willing to figure it out. You need to be willing, if you don't understand something, to ask them. Because I promise you, they want you to understand. Whatever an autistic person is doing to communicate, it's for a reason. And it might not look like your way of communicating, or it might not look like what you are familiar with, but it is what they have. And in any moment, in any given moment, like what someone is giving you, that is what they have. And I can promise you that. I can promise you that any form of communication that an autistic person is giving to you is valuable, and there's a reason that it's happening. There's a reason that they are doing it. There's a reason they are trying to express themselves in whatever way that may be. So don't ever assume that any form of communication can just be ignored or isn't as valuable as another. It's frustrating not being able to feel like you are heard or understood, even if you are speaking the same language as others, right? Like even if I'm verbally communicating with someone, even then it can still be so frustrating feeling like you are not heard or you are not understood, like you are still not able to communicate in the way that they expect you to, right? So let alone being unable to speak momentarily, periodically, or even perpetually. And that obviously is not my experience because I'm sitting here speaking now, but it's just something that should really be thought about and spoken about. And typically it's always the lower support needs autistics like me who are sitting here on the floor speaking that will be listened to at least some extent over the higher support needs autistics, because more people relate, more people can identify with the form of communication that I am working with right now, right? But this is not any more valuable than other forms. I've been thinking a lot lately about communication as an autistic person, especially when it comes to communicating with non-autistic people around you and trying to get them to understand, trying to be heard, and feeling like what you have in the moment might not be enough because it isn't the form of communication that is most valued, but it absolutely should be. Yeah, hopefully I'll be back yapping again sometime soon. It felt so weird. I really had nothing to say. I don't know how else to explain it. I just really felt so empty inside. But it's a start. It's a start to yapping again.